These are the crank turners. They're murdering people. Europe is going to save Greece and Spain and all these other nations. Batteries, batteries, batteries. Now the alkaline battery, beating employees in the third world and starving them half to death and forcing them to work in labor camps. Hi again, and welcome to the Remi Review. This is the show where we ask some good questions. We try to come up with some good answers. I will always have new content because for everything that I say on here, there are teams of people accepting corporate money to come up with false answers to those good questions and to come up with false questions for the good answers, throwing in all this false crap information, and they're being compensated very well.
It's corrupt.
Now, not all these people know exactly what they're doing. They're not paying attention to how the system actually works. I call these people the crank turners. The crank turners, right? We're gonna get... These are the crank turners. The crank turners. They're turning a crank. That's what they do all day. They just turn a crank. And the crank isn't... Crank's not... It's not hooked up to anything, but they're turning it. They go to school for years to learn how to turn the crank, and then they get a job turning the crank, and they maybe, in a few years they'll bring in an apprentice and they'll teach them how to turn the crank, or after they've worked through most of their useful years of labor turning that crank, they'll go back as consultants and they'll help other people learn how to turn that crank. Everyone turning these cranks. You're sitting in an office tower, you're typing a button, you're hitting buttons all day long. I'm hitting buttons, hitting buttons, hitting buttons. It's just a button and a number comes up, and then they hit more buttons and more numbers come up, but they're not actually doing something. They're turning a crank. A crank, it's not hooked up to anything. Well, no, I don't want to say that. There is something on the other end of that crank. There is death, there is destruction, there's poverty, starvation. Lots of things are actually hooked up to that crank.
Say what?
You think that you're being productive, you're contributing to society by being a productive member turning that crank. You're turning that crank for business. Oh, well, if I'm turning a crank for business, I'm contributing, I'm helping the nation, I'm helping other people, because you're paying taxes. Right? That's what it comes down to, paying taxes. So I'm going to turn this crank so they can issue money out of nowhere to give me for turning the crank, and then I got to give, a large portion of it back in taxes that's given back to the people who are employing me to turn this crank.
That's so not right.
That's the system we live in. Every time you hit those buttons, you are sending a command, and you can try and disconnect yourself from it, but there is another end of that command line. You're employed by a group that has a purpose. You need to make profit for your shareholders. Legally, it has to make money for its shareholders, or at least has to try to make money for its shareholders. So as a crank turner for that corporation, you are pressing buttons with the intention that you can make money for the shareholders from it. So you're posed with a question, and you need to tap a button. Now, if you tap this button, there will be more profit, but down the line, somebody's going to get screwed. You tap this button, there will be less profit, less people getting screwed, but you're not doing your job properly, and you risk losing your employment because of it. These crank turners, you're not contributing to the nation by turning the corporate crank, the international crank. You're destroying your nation. These conglomerates are more powerful than our governments now. So every time you turn that crank for them, they dismantle your government. They force you into more debt and into more poverty. They ensure that your children are going to be indentured servants. This is what you're getting from turning the crank. Now, the crank turners, in their defense, are very busy. They have obligations that they need to meet, so they need the money from their job to meet those obligations. They're being told very well-structured propaganda that convinces them that the system is a way that it isn't, so that they think that, you know, poverty around the world is because people are lazy or because there isn't enough supply, none of which is true. In essence, they want the crank turners to be just smart enough to turn the crank, but not to look behind the crank and see that it's not hooked up to anything, or that it's hooked up to poverty and starvation. They don't want you to see that. They just want you to concentrate on that crank. Concentrate on the crank. Keep cranking. Don't think. Don't do anything else. Just crank. And that's why you see a lot of people in business who are very gung-ho when they're young, but they hit their 30s, they hit their 40s, and then they have maybe a moral crisis or something, and they get out. Or maybe they just get out because they were so damn busy. The policymakers were having them turn that crank so heavy that they realized, you know, I'm not going to get to live my life if I just keep cranking this thing.
News fail.
News, okay. News fail. I was just going to quickly cover something I saw on global TV internet. I don't know, it's not internet, it was a text, but it's still called global TV. Anyway. They're talking about how Europe is going to save Greece and Spain and all these other nations in Europe that are going under. How are they going to be saved? And the plan now is to issue bonds. So they're going to write some crap on a piece of paper, and then the European Central Bank will issue a bunch of new euros on behalf of that nation, give it to the nation, who will in turn purchase these pieces of crap written on papers by the private banks. They'll purchase those from them, giving all this newly printed money straight to private bankers. And the further obligation that they're going to give them is to back this new money with real world assets. So they're going to go after these nations. They're going to say, well, you know, you've got to give the European Central Bank all your gold. You've got to give up some of your land. This is in addition to the austerity measures that they're already forcing everyone into. They're going to start asking for real world things to back up these loans. Because ultimately, that's all there is in the world, is real world things, real productivity, real resources.
Testify!
And that's what these people are after. They don't care about money. Of course they don't. They can issue limitless free money. They've been doing that for 30 years, issuing limitless free money for themselves. They're not interested in money. They want the actual assets. And that's what's happening now. We're going to be asked to back all this money with the assets of our nation.
That's so not right.
You can't fix debt with more debt. Already, when they're issuing these new debts, the new debts are going to have higher rates of interest than the old debts. If the nation couldn't sustain itself with the debt load that it currently had, how is it going to sustain itself with more debt and more interest? That's madness.
Yeah, tell him, man.
So in a couple of years, or a year, 6 months, whenever the country is back into the exact same situation where their debt is oppressing them and taking away their ability to produce, they're going to have to start giving up the real assets. They're going to have to give away their land, give away their gold reserves, give away the things that the country has that are actually worth something. And they're going to give it to international bankers who are owned by their shareholders, who are rich people everywhere. We've got to wise up already. Countries are not in competition anymore. Rich people are in competition with poor people globally. The rich people have globalized. The poor need to globalize as well. We need to reestablish our nations. We need to draw lines in the sand where we say, sorry, your international bank isn't going to cross this line unless it's on our terms, because this is our country.
Get him, Big Rem!
We are sovereign nations that don't need international bankers issuing us currency out of nowhere.
Consume!
Okay, so consume part of the show. Got a few batteries here. Got some Fang Nang batteries, some other bizarre batteries. Now the alkaline battery. This is the biggest scam, the biggest consumption scam I've ever seen. Alkaline batteries. You can charge alkaline batteries. They've had the technology to do this for 20, 30 years at least. You can charge them safely. You're not going to see it in Walmart because they don't want you to charge these. They want you to throw it out. The crank turners need to justify the fact that they're turning these cranks, so they want you to throw things out so that the crank needs to keep turning. The crank needs to keep turning, so we make more batteries so we can throw out more batteries, keep turning the crank. And another thing interesting, you look on any battery. Now, you use batteries in children's toys, right? Children's toys, you use batteries. Now, they'll give you a warning that says this may explode, this may leak and burn your hand off, or whatever bullshit they say on here. Let me ask you this, if this is so dangerous that it can explode, that it can burn your hand off, why does it not have CSA approval? It goes into children's toys and it's explosive and full of chemicals that can seriously damage you, but it doesn't have CSA approval. Why? Because it doesn't need it.
Yeah, bring the truth, man.
It doesn't need CSA approval. The chemicals inside an alkaline battery are no more dangerous than squishing a lemon. I've had it happen. I've had old batteries before. I've seen them leak. I've gotten it on my hands. It burns a little bit, but it's not extremely dangerous, as the batteries are going to explode and blow up my house. It's all just designed so that we can keep throwing these things into the garbage, boosting circulation. It's a big pile of shit.
Yeah, boy.
It's fear-mongering to boost circulation, to boost productivity. But I mean, I hate that word. I even hate the word productivity, because keep continuing to build something that we're just throwing into landfills that we didn't need to create in the first place is not productivity. That's the opposite of productivity. That's inefficiency.
Culture.
Culture. Jim Smetchland, with very little time left on the clock. On the camera, little time, not much. Who knows what we'll be listening to today, but prep your ears. Prepare to be mildly entertained. Or you could turn off the program